Greetings, students. This is Professor Jacques. As we have been doing this entire week, we are continuing our conversations with voices from the field so that you get firsthand knowledge from the folks who are doing the work out at nonprofit and third sector community-based organizations. We want you to hear from the folks that are in leadership in your community, how they're centering justice, how they're addressing issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, how they are practicing the things that you're learning about in this class. So I'm really excited to introduce you to a great colleague, friend, and I'm not going to say mentee because you have been mentored by the best. I just happen to be along for the ride. So will you take a moment and introduce yourself, talk about your role and your responsibility in the title of the organization that you're at?
Yeah, so my name is Bemnet Meshesha, and I serve as the manager of community relations and strategic development for the State Fair of Texas. I'm sure you're wondering, how is the State Fair community org? And it is a nonprofit, and we take a certain amount of the revenue that's generated through the fair and reinvest it back in community in the form of grants, sponsorships, as well as supporting programming and training. My job is to really oversee those programs and help give structure and access to our philanthropy that we do. And so been there for about 3 years now. Background is in social work as well as psych and business. And so it's a little bit of an intersection with social enterprise meets social welfare meets a lot of government institutions, private institutions. And so what does it look like when all of these worlds collide in a very fun space like the fair, and how do we use our brand as a catalyst for change?
Brilliant. Will you tell us about the way the State Fair of Texas and its efforts and programming are addressing issues of inequity in the city of Dallas?
Yeah, no, that's a great one. So a big part, as you guys may know, that the State Fair is immediately around, or the area surrounding the State Fair is the South Dallas Fair Park area, which is one of the most impoverished zip codes. It's also a zip code that has a high return of formerly incarcerated people. It's also an area that has a strong female-led household, which means that it's primarily like a single family household as well. And so it's also one of those corners in the city that doesn't have good access to transportation. There is no major grocery store, so it's also a food desert. There are some smaller clinics, but there's some challenges there. We've had some school closures in that area as well, so you can imagine the inaccessibility for students in education. So it's a highly concentrated area of experiencing barriers. And so the State Fair is uniquely positioned because we are a neighbor to those who are experiencing a lot of these challenges. And so a lot of the work we do it in 3 areas, which is supporting nonprofits, economic development, supporting economic development opportunities, and then supporting education initiatives. And so we came about to doing these 3 initiatives because we did specifically my boss did some listening in community when she first started the job, and really learning where are people having difficulty experiencing progress, like where is it really hard to move the needle. And these ended up these 3 points were the pain points by community members that were felt, that then were starting places for us to really start building strong relationships and networks, and bringing attention to and bringing resources to those spaces. And so and so the fair does it through our partnerships, by leveraging our brand, by giving grants. We're one of the few funders in the city of Dallas, and quite honestly, probably in the state of Texas, that our primary grantees are people of color and organizations led by people of color. I think foundations right now give about 7% of their funding to people who are led by people of color, and we're almost the inverse of that. We're like 90%, 93% plus, right? And so we're very intentional about leveraging resources and relationships. We also do a lot of cohorts. So we do a lot of coalition building, cohort building, training models, so that people are growing in their capacity, not just in their work, but in the way that they are working with their partners and their clients as well. And so we're a very asset-based community development model, heavy community affairs department.
That's really exciting to know. I'm sure most people hadn't thought about the fair beyond big techs and amazing corny dogs. So to know that the fair is actively involved in investing in community, especially the community that looks like the area in which they're centrally located. So I'm curious, like, what are the root cause issues? How did South Dallas Fair Park come to be in such dire need of these types of resources?
Yeah, so I mean, we would be remiss if we're not talking about a racialized context, and how they were very intentional, racially motivated, but also racially consequential decisions that were made by the city, quite honestly, by the state fair, that played a role in some of the redlining, some of the removing of land from indigenous ownership. There was a depletion of resources. There was an intentional starvation of resources to this community, as the community was once primarily white and then had a Jewish stronghold and then eventually became Black. And there's, a history of bombings in South Dallas that really hurt the Black community. And so at one point in time, it was the hub of the Black community, and it was the hub of Black leadership and Black business, and it once used to be a thriving community. And so we know that nothing happens overnight, and that there's a lot of institutional policies and practices, both by elected officials, business officials, and others who have contributed to this really kind of terrible and dire space that our community is in right now. That said, outside of even those individuals, what happens when you divest from a community, right? When you divest in their education systems, when you divest in housing, right? When we are not worried about a middle class, when we think that providing housing is providing projects, right? So there's even policies that have been enacted in those spaces that have contributed. But I think the main one we have to focus on is the kind of this racialized distribution of resources, or the depletion of resources, or withholding of resources based on race that has a deep and strong root in South Dallas.
So I imagine when you're engaging with community-based organizations or even with other philanthropic partners, that's not how you lead a conversation.
Right.
But you have to, it's a part of the work that you do. It guides the work that you do. So how do you talk about that truth when you're engaging with community-based organizations and community residents, and when you're engaging with colleagues, philanthropic partners, and others at, I would say, elevated power level?
Yeah, so it's definitely a political world, right? Poverty is political. Somebody has to gain in order for people to stay poor. I mean, that just is what it is. And so how do you navigate that as practitioners coming into that space when the people who hold power are some of the people that perpetuated poverty? Or even if it wasn't them as individuals, but institutions. And so one of, for me, the key things that I do is if I'm in a space and if the fair played a role in that, I'm usually good about acknowledging it, acknowledging the history of the organization or the institution I represent and the hurt or harm that they've brought into community, right? Because I've chosen to affiliate myself, and that's the best way to bring healing for the people. And to start with an acknowledgement of truth. So then it's not like, are we ignoring the elephant in the room? And it's like, no, here's the elephant and I'm going to address it. So that's one. And that was an adjustment even for me, because as a person of color, I didn't really feel like that was my responsibility, because I'm like, I didn't do that. That wasn't me. But in reality, as practitioners, when we affiliate ourselves with a brand that has a history, it's our responsibility, A, to know the history, and B, to own the history, so that we can provide a space for healing and a path forward. So there hasn't been too many times I've had to do that, but I have done it. Outside of that, I really try to move in a space of finding shared objectives. So even in how I build partnerships and how I work in coalition building and doing a cohort model, you find a couple of people who have the same goal. They may not have the same starting point. They may not even have the same ending point, but they have this shared objective to, giving a simple example, to provide school supplies for students at Lincoln High School, right, which is one of our high schools. And so that's always a good place to start, right? Where do we agree, and how do we bring our resources, our relationships, and our partnerships to work on that goal, kind of apart from the other stuff. And if the goal helps our community partners and aligns with some of our strategic plan, we usually engage in some way or another, unless there's like major reasons for us not to. And then I think it really just develops from there, right? Even with power holders who are on opposite sides, maybe philosophically or ideologically, as I would be, and that gives you kind of a ground to kind of start working together. And then you build relationships and knowledge for each other, and ownership and trust, like rapport, that like, okay, we may not agree on these things, but I know that you care about serving students in X way. And so we can co-labor in this space together. And the other part is being wise on navigating political spaces, right? Because you have a lot of elected officials who are involved, especially in our work and that neighborhood, like primarily impoverished communities tend to have a high political presence, right? Because they tend to have people that are always speaking on their behalf. We don't really have a lot of community empowerment, and the residents don't tend to be the owners of their story and their destiny. And so how do you navigate a space where a lot of people are kind of in and out and you don't really know what your motivations are? And I think even that is kind of the same way of like, okay, here's where I'm putting my stake in my ground, and just kind of want to see who comes to that. But certainly a lot of face showing, keeping your conversations to a minimal sometimes. Like, I think it's an important practice, because you don't know who's connected to who, and how what you say in X space may impact and hinder the work that you're trying to do in another space. So I think if you stay to the work, and we have a motto like, keep your head down and do the work, right? Try to stay away from the fray as much as you can. And I'm sure we can talk a lot more, but I hope those are at least a couple of practical ways of how we've navigated it.
Yes, they are. Thank you. We've spent a lot of time talking about, or I should say, we spent a majority of the beginning of this conversation talking about how you show up professionally, but I'm curious, what's the connection personally to the issues that you're working on? What makes you passionate about doing this work?
Yeah, so when I actually was in grad school for social work, my obsession or cause was really criminal justice reform. And as that pertains specifically to juveniles in that system, and so young people in the prison system or detention system, and that really led me down a bigger path of access and inequities. And so those kind of became my focusing places. And then, as you all I'm sure know, equity and access, or issues with equity and access, exist everywhere. So whether you're talking about food inequities, or access to transportation, or access to safety, right? Like, safety is a right that people have to feel safe in their homes, walking to schools. So you begin to see the disparity in these things and how those same two roots show up. And so I found myself connecting to this work really personally, because I found those two root things existed in a lot of these other ways. But in a very full circle moment, this year, actually next week, we're hosting our first ever Second Chance Resource Fair and job fair for formerly incarcerated people, which has not been done in Dallas County. And so even though we are pushing forward on those other core pillars of nonprofits, supporting nonprofits, education, economic development, we've still found a way to bring back our passion and our commitment to causes of incarceration and inequities in that space. So personally, those are kind of my things. And then I've focused a lot more around race, because as you dig deeper into social issues, at least for me, I've always come back to race as the core root of that it's not that white people are not poor, that Asian people, right? It's like poverty exists, but to whatever problems exist, the way that that intersects with race and that's experienced by people of color, whatever that issue is always magnified. It's always harder, deeper, wider, broader. How, you know, it's a compelling experience that's like distinctly different. And so I'm digging a lot more into that space as well, and it's making us more aware and intentional of how we engage with race and our policies and our funding and our services, and how we talk about it, right? In a city of Dallas, or in a, you know, kind of in this Texas environment where we lightly talk about race but don't really address it, contributes and lends to us not directly solving for it either. And so what does it look like to be in a position where we see the disparities and the differences, and to call out race as a root cause and racism as a root cause, and solutions that involve race as well.
I really appreciate that. In this class, you've been talking about the fact that race is not a thing. You're not born into a particular race. It's something that's socially constructed through practices, policies, procedures, and behaviors, right? And so
Right.
thinking about the role racism plays in perpetuating inequity, and if we just aggregate the data on any social issue, Black people are always, and yeah, I'm just gonna say it, Black people are always at the highest percentage of impact and most
That's right.
pervasive percentage of impact. So what is best practice from a critical race lens is like, if we address the needs of Black people, then by default,
Everybody improves.
yes, everybody improves. Literally, if you just look at the numbers alone, right? It's not because I'm a Black woman I'm saying that. I'm saying if you look at the data, if we impact the quality of life for Black people, we impact the quality of life for women, for trans folks, for anybody who's an immigrant, right? Like everybody wins when Black people win. So I find that really interesting and exciting that it's a lens and a framework by which the State Fair of Texas is prioritizing its community-based work. I'm curious,
Right.
are there ways that I heard you when you say you're digging deeper into that. So what resources, what tools, what books are you reading to help move that process along? What historical things are you looking at?
Yeah, no, there's several things. So there are 3 reports that have been written about kind of a racialized impact or racism's impact on specific areas in Dallas here in the last year and a half. So one is the economic assessment report that was released by Communities Foundation. And it does a great job of realizing our demographic makeup, the changes in our demographic that will be coming between now and 2050, how that looks in our student loan debt and our pay, and kind of, right, this whole, what's the breakdown of that? That's a really good report. You can find it on their website. There's a digital version of that available. There's also Prosperity Now released a report at the end of last year. I think it's like the report card for Dallas, and it's an economic report as well that looks at a number of variables, but specifically at wealth building. And the premise of that is that we are just like one disaster away from fill in the blank, living on the street or being bankrupt or whatever. And so it looks at the asset poverty of Black people and the disparity in that, which I think is really important. Then there is a phenomenal, I actually have it with me, hold on. A third report that we're infusing in our work. It's called A New Community Vision for Dallas. And it was released by Jerry Hawkins with the Dallas Truth Racial Healing and Transformation. It's a project that's funded by the Kellogg Foundation, and it looks at the history of Dallas and how some of our primary institutions came to be. And 2 of the premises is that Dallas was built on stolen land by stolen labor. And And these are academic reports, right, that are founded, that are scientific, that have evidence. And as practitioners, it's our responsibility to understand how these truths are permeating and affecting our clients, our macro systems, right, like our public schools and our city councils. And, so those are three that are kind of top of mind for us at the fair right now that we're talking about, that we're sending out to our community partners so that they can look at and evaluate and understand. We brought out Prosperity Now to come and do a session with all of our nonprofit leaders to, like, what does this mean for you? Because a big part of Prosperity Now's work is supporting organizations led by nonprofits of color as well. It's like a different strategy in winning in that. We brought out TRHT to do that at the fair as well, and give that presentation on a bigger stage and platform. And so we are in a evolving space with this information and making sure it's disseminated, and that we are informed leaders in this nonprofit space, that we understand that impact.
Brilliant, thank you. So that is my last question. And I usually end these conversations by asking my speaker to share with us an aha moment or a space of reflection that can be helpful as our students think about how they're applying the things that they're learning to their lives and their practice. So any aha moment, anything that's been particularly salient that you're learning about or unpacking on your own?
In terms of kind of access and economics and all of that, or just generally in the field? Generally in the field, okay. Ooh, that's a really good question. So, okay, so one is a practice that I started doing just about a month ago. So there is a couple of newsletters that I think are important to subscribe to as well, like the Stanford Social Innovation Review. There's a couple others I subscribe to, I'm blanking. But I decided that in this work of nonprofit that we're like super inundated with a lot of information and probably even more things to do. We don't really get a lot of time to surround ourselves with new learnings, and we don't usually have the time to process even the new things we've learned. So I started taking 20 minutes every morning to like read a snippet, and then I write like, okay, how do I apply what I learned, and what do I need to apply what I learned, and who do I need to apply what I learned? So I asked myself these three questions based on that. And is it like more work? Maybe, but I think it's helping me to find an intentional space to sharpen myself as a leader, because in other spaces of work and professions, you stay competitive. And in our nonprofit space, we don't, because we're overwhelmed. And I don't think it's going to help us with our longevity in staying in this profession as healthy, whole people, but also in being the best dynamic thinkers and strategists and solution providers that we can be. And we are like, there's no other place that's needed more for us to be as innovative and solutions oriented. And so that is one practice that I am incorporating, and it is changing my world because I'm accessing people who get paid to think, right? Like they get paid to research, they get paid to help me think like the next cusp and the next step and the next new way of doing what I'm doing. And so I don't have time to do that. So I want to learn from the people who are. So I recommend that. Just staying on top of your game. And then leadership circles are also something we started last year. So we take a group of nonprofit leaders through I think it's every 2 or 3 months, and we just do like a circle of just leaders, and we had these conversations on what it is like as an ED, as a program manager, whatever it is, like as the leader of their organizations and we literally just talk about leadership in the nonprofit space and giving space for people to experience, again, wholeness and health. Like I didn't realize how toxic this space is for nonprofit people. And so what are some ways you can practice that in your social circles, in your professional circles? Like, how do you intentionally think about leadership and processing and time and teams, and talk about like actual just people challenges as opposed to like organizational challenges like fundraising or, you know, um, you know, whatever, the like board governance, like, right, we need those things too, but if we're not thinking about ourselves as leaders and cultivating best practices amongst ourselves, then we're not giving ourselves the break we need to again have longevity and success. And so that has been life-changing for our nonprofits. It's been like a game changer for them, and we didn't expect it to be, but we realized that there's not a lot of places where they can do that and cultivate that. And so that's also something I would think about. How do you create spaces for people to talk? And because the more relationship and rapport and humanity they get to have in that space, the actually like more likely they are to collaborate and more likely they are to take in what they learn from each other as well. And so a couple things to think about.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for
Yeah.
space to share with students from your professional and lived experience. We really appreciate your time and your energy and the great work that you're doing at the State Fair of Texas. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. You guys take care. Have a good night.